I'm from Nova Scotia, Canada. It was Christmas Day 1990, and I awoke and got out of bed. I went into the living room with my wife and Jennifer. We opened our cards and gifts, appreciating the mood and feeling that Christmas Day has as that particular holiday in honor of the symbolic celebration of Christ's birth, as well as the modern-day Santa Claus mythology that makes Christmas wonderful for the children in our culture. After we had finished opening our gifts, we called our parents and extended family members to wish them a Merry Christmas. We got ready for later in the morning to go to Jennifer's sister's house. We arrived around lunchtime and were greeted by my sister-in-law Sharon, her husband John, and their children, as well as some of John's extended family. We all sat down and drank coffee as Sharon continued to prepare Christmas dinner, which she intended to have ready by 3 p.m. While we waited, John and I went down the hall inside the store, where they both fled. The store was linked to the house and had a small grocery store, a fresh meat counter, and a pizza parlor. We went there to play some of the video games in the store, and then tried to outscore each other on them. I was suddenly struck with a severe pain in my chest. It was agonizing. My body started dripping wet with sweat, and according to others there, I began to turn a bluish tinge around my lips and fingernail areas of my extremities. John chose to assist me through the hallway and a doorway that separated the business from the living room part of the house. I slumped on the floor as soon as I entered the living room. Like dropping a bag of potatoes onto the floor is how I like to express how I felt. It happened quickly. It was cold outside, and I was in medical trouble. Sharon also dialed 911 at this time, and an ambulance was dispatched to the address. While it was on its way, my wife, Sharon, and a couple of her extended family members were attempting to get me comfortable lying on the floor by elevating my head and placing a pillow under my neck. The last thing I remembered is the intense pain, and then I had a sense of falling, and this sensation seemed to last forever. My consciousness was no longer inside me, but my awareness, or essence, was outside of my body. I was in the midst of this falling experience when, like a cork popping, I found my consciousness or awareness from a position outside of the constraints of my physical body. The horrible pain I'd been experiencing simply vanished, leaving me perfectly unnoticed. My wife and Sharon then yelled at me, shaking and saying, "Paul, please don't go. You're slipping." Their sounds were fading and resonating. I could still consciously recognize and hear them, but their voices sounded like they were a long way away. My following realization was the oddest of all. Throughout the procedure, I became aware of being conscious outside of what I considered the physical body's bounds. My seeing vision, if we can call it that, was probably approximately 12 feet away at 45-degree angle from where my body was laying on the floor. I could see my wife, her sister, and her sister-in-law. I also recalled that I, or my conscious essence, was floating above and away from where my physical body was resting on the living room floor, and that my consciousness was not contained within the limitations of my physical body. Even though my consciousness was near to the ceiling, I had the distinct impression of being able to view 360-degree all around me from wherever I was. While I was conscious of being outside of my body, I couldn't place a timestamp on it. Perhaps a couple of minutes had already passed, or perhaps 30 seconds, or other variables of time in between, but it felt like a couple of minutes. The loss of sense of time became immediately apparent, and I recollect feeling the presence of a loving spiritual entity. I suppose the best way to describe it is that it felt like someone I knew, or someone who cared about me in the manner that a grandfather or a grandma would. I couldn't see him or her, but I definitely felt their presence. In addition, I felt an unseen force pulling me away from my physical body, and it appeared like I was fighting this experience. It was also at this time when the front door to the living room, or the primary entry to the house, opened, and through it came Sharon's two next-door neighbors. One of them was a part-time employee at the business, and the other was her husband, a school bus driver. They came to offer assistance while Jennifer, Sharon, and extended family members were caring for me while paramedics arrived. I recall seeing an ambulance attendant enter the front door with a life support kit box and another attendant, a paramedic, enter with a stretcher, supported on the other end by one of the next-door neighbors. This was all happening while I was staring down from the ceiling, as if I were looking down from the ceiling. I recall the feeling of the air glowing, or the atmosphere being filled with all these little speckles of white light around this time. In reality, everything was glowing or illuminating with light speckles, similar to the mirror ball lights used at dances. Even the people in the room had a tiny glow to them. They had a translucent ethereal shine to them. You couldn't see through them, but instead of being solid, they appeared to have a color of light radiating from them. I recall telling myself that it seemed like I was in a state of confusion in my mind's eye, but I was completely aware that my conscious self was beyond the boundaries of my physical body, since my body was on the floor and there were people gathered around my physical body who were frightened and upset. It was at this point that the paramedics took over from my family members who were caring for me. I recall them taking my vitals and then putting an oxygen mask on my face. I have no conscious remembrance of what happened in the following moments. My next recollection of consciousness or conscious memory occurred when I awoke inside the ambulance as it approached the hospital's emergency department. If my recollection serves me well, this was probably around 2:30 p.m. I recall waking up with tremendous chest discomfort and difficulty breathing. The paramedics were instructing me to breathe gently and be as calm as possible. I recall the ambulance riding over a bumpy bump as they backed up into the receiving area at the emergency department door. My stretcher was wheeled through metal and glass doors to the triage area, where a charge nurse took over. They wheeled me into the cardiac resuscitation room after performing a quick assessment. Soon after, interns began drawing blood from the undersides of my wrists to obtain an arterial blood gas sample and inserting an IV in my other arm. The oxygen was transported from the small portable tank to the in-hospital source of oxygen via a mask placed over my face. While they were working on me, the staff was advising me to stay cool, and I recall them asking Jennifer questions about my age, medical history, symptoms, drugs I was currently taking, and other pertinent information. The staff now had my medical chart, and they noted that it had been around 1 year and 2 months since I underwent major thoracic surgery to my esophagus, which was also performed at the same hospital approximately 14 months prior to this day. The doctor was chatting to my wife and asking me questions at the same time, while I was still drowsy and in tremendous agony in my chest, though it had lessened since I'd recovered consciousness in the ambulance. A doctor arrived a short time later with the findings of my blood gas tests and directed the nurses to start a heparin drip immediately. While all of this was going on, I was still groggy. However, I recall hearing the doctor tell the nurses and my wife that my blood oxygen saturation was around 63%, which was significantly below the standard 97 to 99% percentage they prefer to see. The team jumped into action, running off EKG strips. They had me sign a consent document and were getting ready to inject me with an anti-clotting machine. They believed it was necessary, yet if I had internal bleeding any place in my body, I may have died. Nonetheless, they suggested that the benefits of this clot-busting machine outweighed the risks, so I agreed to the IV injection. I recall the doctor telling my wife and staff that with my O2 at 63% and blood gases so low that I shouldn't even be cognizant or awake. And because I had a history of pulmonary embolism, I was most likely suffering a recurrence. On this Christmas Day, they diagnosed me with blood clots in my lungs, based on how the symptoms manifested themselves and how my vitals and symptoms had changed over the previous hour. The symptoms started out quickly. I was lying on the stretcher, aware that if any more clots entered my lungs at this time, I would die. The staff had no idea how near I was to death, because I had not told them about my out-of-body experience that occurred about 30 minutes before. The hospital professionals informed my wife and family members that when blood gases are that low, some individuals do not survive, and they were shocked that I was even conscious. Because the coronary care unit was completely filled, they had to admit and transfer me to another hospital. Another 2 ambulance workers arrived within an hour and did the same thing. When I arrived, I was transferred to the 3rd floor intensive care unit. It too was full, so they readied another room next door to the ICU and placed me in a room with 3 other patients, all of whom had major heart problems. The hospital had a nurse assigned to a room 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Later that night, another doctor arrived. At the time, I was also attended to by an intern and two other doctors. They were unable to take me down to nuclear medicine to get my lungs scanned because it was Christmas Day. However, based on the arterial blood gas readings and my medical history of recurring blood clots since 1984, as well as my vitals that day, they were positive that pulmonary embolism was the reason for this medical crisis. They put me on an intravenous drip of heparin, or anticoagulant, and put me in bed. I couldn't get out of bed for the following 7 days. My vitals gradually recovered, and on January 3, 1991, they took me down to nuclear medicine to have my lungs scanned again. The anticoagulants were working, and I was beginning to recuperate from the clots. However, this hospital stay was lengthy, lasting until around January 21, little under 4 weeks. This Christmas Day experience would forever alter my life. Having a conscious remembrance of being outside of my body was a profoundly spiritual awakening event. I felt complete happiness and a sense of belonging to the cosmos. There can only be one explanation: a blessing. As a result, life changes began on this day, which have spiritually evolved me to where I am today.